A steady rain fell over Raleigh, North Carolina on Monday, July 14, 1975. The bad weather didn't stop the 300 to 500 protesters, some of whom had traveled from Chicago, Richmond, Norfolk, and Baltimore, as they marched from the Women's Correctional Center through the streets of downtown Raleigh and finally gathered on the steps of the Wake County Courthouse. Flanked by police in riot gear, and you see those images there, demonstrators carried banners that read, "Stop slave labor in NC prisons," Black Panther Party's demands freedom for Sister Joan Little, drop the charges, and women have a right to self-defense. The demonstrators had gathered for the first day of the Joan Little trial, a story that had exploded to nationwide and international attention over the previous 10 months. On August 27, 1974, 20-year-old inmate, black inmate, Joan Little escaped from Beaufort County Jail in the small town of Washington, North Carolina, after killing Clarence Alligood, a white officer at the facility. Another officer found Alligood dead in Little's cell, naked from the waist down with ejaculate on his thigh. Little was gone. When she turned herself into the State Bureau of Investigation 1 week later, Little claimed that she had acted in self-defense, stabbing Alligood 11 times with an ice pick that he had brought into her cell so he could sexually assault her. The state of North Carolina charged Little with first-degree murder, a crime that held a mandatory sentence of the death penalty. With the prompting of Little's lawyer, Jerry Paul, a civil rights attorney who worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Joan Little story quickly gained nationwide attention. As a Time magazine article explained, quote, "What began as an obscure slang in a small-town Southern jail has burgeoned into an expensive legal struggle and an emotional national controversy," end quote. By the time of the trial in July 1975, nearly every major newspaper in the country was covering it. Dozens of demonstrations for Little's innocence had taken place across the country, and the case had even gained international attention. The Little case sat at a very particular crossroads of race, sex, and class. Joan was young, black, female, indigent, and imprisoned. Her attacker was white, male, and her jailer. These set of circumstances resonated with three major active social movements at the time, all of which gave Little their most ardent support: civil rights, prisoners' rights, and women's liberation. Each of these movements politicized the Little case from their particular perspectives, and it became a cause célèbre for all three of these rights-based movements. The Little case, therefore, serves as a window into the conditions necessary for rape and sexual violence to garner political interest and get increased political activism. I'm going to be talking mostly about the civil rights support and the women's liberation support because of the limited time. I won't get into prisoners' rights, although the panel is about incarceration. The civil rights and feminist movements both had a considerable history of taking up sexual violence as a political issue, both in terms of organizing around individual cases and confronting sexual violence as a social problem. The Little case is unique, however, because of the convergence of political agendas that manifested around this single victim. As different groups raced to claim Little as their own, competing understandings of the problem of sexual violence came head to head, particularly between the feminist and civil rights movements. While feminists may have deemed rape a woman's issue in the 1970s, civil rights activists also claimed sexual assault as a key issue in the Black freedom struggle. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, civil rights activists rallied around cases of interracial rape, seeking justice for the historic and continuing suffering of Black men who were accused and convicted of raping white women, as well as championing the cause of Black women who suffered from sexual violence by white men. The tensions that developed as different movements struggled to respond to the crisis of sexual violence speak to how contentious the concept of rape is. The political disagreements between groups resulted in a lack of collaboration and a failure to create a unified front around Little. Despite this, the trial resulted in gains for both Little herself and the movements that supported her. A grand jury acquitted Little of all charges on August 14, 1975. The civil rights, prisoners' rights, and feminist movements each claimed victory. This is a particularly interesting case because feminists have been mobilizing since the early 1970s against rape and claimed the issue as their own. Thousands of women nationwide during the early 1970s created an active and effective anti-rape movement, and sexual assault became a major feminist battleground. By the time of the Little trial in 1975, the women's liberation movement had firmly placed the issue of sexual assault into public consciousness. To the dismay of many feminists, racism and not sexism became the prevailing issue in this case, both in terms of the approach of the legal defense team and the media reporting. This paper argues that understanding the politics of rape in the 1970s requires us to look at both the newly emerged feminist understanding as well as the decades of rich analysis from the civil rights perspective that preceded it. So this next section is going to talk about the civil rights perspective, and it's titled "Southern Justice on Trial Again," and that's how it was described in one newspaper. Civil rights activists and organizations spearheaded the efforts to defend and acquit Little. Very quickly, the story of this young black prisoner who saved herself from her white jailer's attack caught the attention of civil rights leaders. From a civil rights perspective, the Little case symbolized the historic injustice of white oppression against blacks, and in particular, black women's struggle for justice against white male sexual violence. Black rights organizers cultivated an image of Southern justice on trial, an image which the media promptly picked up. Here was the story of a black woman defending herself against a white man in the deeply racist South. The legal system, in turn, prosecuted her rather than her attacker. For many, Little's story fit the scenario of a black defendant powerless against the law in a stereotypically racist, small racist Southern town. One Beaufort County resident who was resentful and somewhat mocking of his characterization described the scenario, and this is what this guy said. She's there in jail, so defenseless, so innocent, and she gets raped and ravaged by this gross jailer, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she struck out trying to defend herself. She had to kill the jailer, and now those ignorant old rednecks are going to get their revenge on her. They're going to make her pay for it with her life. End quote. Invoking this rhetoric of Southern justice, the Chicago Defender, one of the most widely read black newspapers at the time, reported in March of 1975, quote, "Joan Little faces the wrath of a white community where to be black is a sin which no law of God or man can wash away," end quote. Little's act of self-defense would therefore situate her within a legacy of response by black people against the white power structure. Now I'll talk briefly about the women's liberation approach to the Little case. And this section is called Power to the Ice Pick. This is why I love women's liberation sometimes. And of course there was crossover between the civil rights movement, of course, agreed in some ways with women's liberation, their analysis, but I'm pulling out what are like their major rallying points. When feminists and others rallied on the Wake County Superior Courthouse steps chanting, 1, 2, 3, Joanne must be set free, 4, 5, 6, power to the ice pick. They were confronting what they understood as two major failures of the criminal legal system. First, the legal system criminalized the victim in cases of rape and not the rapist. And second, the law did not support a woman's right to self-defense. Feminists criticized a criminal legal system that they believed criminalized the victim, not the attacker, in cases of rape. This was most obvious in cases where women used self-defense against their rapists and were then punished for doing so. In these self-defense cases, feminists argued that the real criminal was not the woman who fought back, but the man who had raped her or attempted to rape her. The Little case, therefore, clearly resonated with this perspective. Outside the Wake County Courthouse, women carried picket signs with the slogan, "Why have a trial? The criminal is already dead." According to the feminist perspective, the only crime committed was the rape, and, quote, "the case had no business coming to trial in the first place," end quote. The criminal legal system wrongly portrayed Little's killing of Oligood as murder, rather than the act of self-defense that it actually was. Justice could only be served, therefore, if the trial was called off. This viewpoint was made clear in a petition circulated by the Chicago Women's Committee to free Joan Little, which urged the governor of North Carolina to drop all charges. The petition stated, quote, "It is abundantly clear that the death of Oligood resulted from his own crime of attempted rape. The criminal is already dead," end quote. In the eyes of the law, the crime was the murder of Oligood. In the eyes of feminists, the crime was the rape. As a November 1974 article in the feminist news journal Off Our Backs simply explained, quote, "In North Carolina, Joan Little faces a first-degree murder charge for defending herself against rape," end quote. I think that really sums up the feminist perspective. Rather than prosecuting the rapist, the legal system put the victim on trial. And then, getting back to my argument about rape as a contested concept and sexism losing out to racism in the reporting. 2 days before the trial began, the Washington Star declared it the biggest civil rights trial of the 70s. London Daily Mail journalist Jane Gaskell echoed this sentiment when she reported that in the week prior to Little's acquittal that, quote, the trial is one of the most controversial cases ever heard in America's Deep South. Somewhat of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. This representation speaks to how much the case resonated with the goals of the Black freedom struggle. Reflecting on the case 6 months following Little's acquittal, Mark Pinsky, a freelance journalist who helped break the story and closely covered the case for several major news services, commented that, quote, sexism lost out to racism in the reporting, end quote. Many feminists, however, disagreed and argued instead that sexism was the prevailing issue in this and all cases of rape. Following Little's acquittal, the Denver-based feminist news journal Big Mama Rag published an article titled, this is interesting, Little Freed, Feminism Raped, end quote. Here the author commented, the painfully obvious fact that she is a woman and was raped because she was a woman was not seen as part of Little's situation. Similarly, in response to an article Angela Davis wrote an article in June of 1975 in Ms. Magazine where she analyzed the Joan Little case from both the perspective of racism and sexism, but mostly racism. So similar, one reader from Reedsburg, Wisconsin wrote, I must question Ms. Davis's emphasis on racism as a primary factor in the act of rape. Rape is an act of aggression on the part of a man towards a woman, and it seems to me, therefore, to be primarily a sexist act. During the 1970s, different groups and rights-based social movements grappled with the meaning of rape. Cases like that of Joan Little highlight what a contested issue sexual violence had become, even amongst those who agreed that change was needed.